Thank you, Donna, and thank you to the NGV and to your team and to everyone here for hosting us in this beautiful space tonight. It's really great to be able to partner again. Thanks to all of you for coming in such a large number to launch our Disruptive Asia Volume 5 publication and join this discussion on disrupting gender bias in the region. So for those of you who don't know, Disruptive Asia is Asia Society Australia annual publication, and we look at new perspective on how Asia is impacting Australia's foreign policy, economy, and society in the region through long-form essays. We've been doing this project for 5 years now, and over the years we've looked at the tilt of power towards Asia, the shifting influence of ASEAN, our relationship with China, and the region's response to climate change. And so all these issues are national, regional, and global disruptors. But we found that women and girls sit across all these layers. It's 2020, and I think, I don't need to tell you that there's still a lot to be done for us to achieve gender equality. If anything, the events of the last few years have been detrimental to the freedom and rights of women around the world. From the devastating impact of the pandemic to the rollback of abortion rights in the US, to the fact that young girls in Afghanistan no longer have access to high school education, or even to the fact that the new national gender pay gap in Australia is 14.1%. So achieving gender equality will require an all-of-society effort. That's why we wanted to dedicate this volume of Disruptive Asia to women and girls, and we wanted to look at how women and girls in the region are changing the economic, political, and social dynamics, but also how they're being impacted themselves by these changes. So, of course, there is no single female experience, and there are as many experiences as there are women. But, and we only have 17 essays in this publication, so there's only 17 experiences. But we did find some common threads within the essays. These include the importance of mentorship and network, the tension between tradition and modernity, the difficulties of navigating work-life challenges, and the immense economic benefit of unlocking women's full potential. But something that really ran through each essay was this issue of bias. And I'll come back to bias in a second, but before I do, I just want to acknowledge the support of the Victorian government and the Daisy Oxenham Innovation Fund for making this year's edition possible. I would also like to acknowledge our advisory group for their expertise and guidance, and thank all of our authors for so generously giving us their time and insight. And I know there's a few of you in the room tonight. On a more personal note, it was a pleasure to work alongside Greg Earle on this volume. Greg has edited all 5 volumes of Disruptive Asia, and his insight, knowledge, and guidance are unmeasurable. I also want to thank Philip Ivanov, our CEO, who isn't here today, but I want to thank him for trusting me with this project. And of course, I want to thank the entire Asia Society team, with a special mention to Chris Katuki, our associate, who has helped me a lot on these essays. Now, I want to say I am so pleased to finally hold this volume in my hand, because, as Donna said, it's been a long time in the making. And reading through it, it made me very angry at times, but it also made me smile, and it also gave me hope. And above all, it made me want to do a lot more to fight for women and girls' empowerment all over the world. And I hope that you get to read these essays as well. They are on our website, and you can also get access to them here. And I hope that they will inspire you to do more as well. And I want to say to those of you in the room today that empowering women and fighting bias can start right here, right now, with how you talk to your kids, how you talk to your employees, and how you talk to your parents, or anyone really. Actually, one of my earliest memory is being criticized by my family for being a garçon manqué. So now that's the French word for a tomboy. And in French, it literally translates to failed boy. So that was really, French people are poetic. And I was criticized for being a tomboy because I was always playing around in playgrounds and, in sand and in mud in dresses, and that was really not ladylike. So I became really hyper aware of how I was perceived, and I struggled for a long time with what it meant to be a girl. And as a kid, I wanted to be the first French female president, and I also wanted to be a princess. And I wanted to be soft and kind and liked, but I also wanted to be respected and strong. And I think many of you in the room have had this experience of never being enough, whatever way whatever you do, you're always too much or too little. And I'm still working on fighting these deeply rooted, very often unconscious bias when it comes to being a woman. But now I know that feminism and empowering women isn't about having to choose one or the other. It's about fighting to make sure that every woman and girl has the potential or can become whatever it is that they want to be, and that every woman and girl have the same opportunity as men and boys from the moment that they're born to their first step in school to the first day on the job. So today we want to break down stereotypes, and we want to redefine what it means to be a woman. And it's also a celebration of the 26 women and men who contributed to this publication and the many more who are actively changing the region's economy, politics, and society. Speaking of, it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of women who will share with us the importance and challenges of breaking bias when it comes to gender empowerment. Sunita Lewis is the curatorial project officer for Asian art at the National Gallery of Victoria. She contributes to the thoughtful development and management of the NGV's collection and helps to present Asian art to a broad audience through exhibition and displays. And Sunita today is going to talk to us about how women are perceived in art and how and the experience of women artists as well. And I think it's going to be really interesting. Robyn Mudie is the first Assistant Secretary for the Southeast Asia Regional Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and she was most recently Australian Ambassador to Vietnam. And Robyn is also one of the authors of Disruptive Asia, who and her essay looks at how women have changed the international security agenda. Div Pillay is CEO and co-founder of MindTribes and social enterprise Cultural Diverse Women. And she specializes on race and cultural inclusion. And her specialty is backed by her personal experience of living under racially segregated apartheid laws before migrating to Australia, and her behavioral psychology background. And have a look at her LinkedIn because it's amazing. I just want to be everything she is. And today's discussion will be moderated by Yasmin Poole, who is also one of the Disruptive Asia authors. Yasmin is an award-winning speaker, board director, and youth advocate. She's a Plan International's national ambassador and champions the importance of young women being heard in Australia's political conversation. So these are 4 incredible women, and I invite you to visit our website to see their full bios because they have done more things than I can say in this short introduction. But I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We were having a few chats before the event began, and if the conversation is anything like what I've just heard, we're going to have a great night. So thanks again so much for joining us. It's now my pleasure to invite our speakers to the stage, and I'll hand it over to Yasmin for the discussion. Thank you.
So, first of all, I just want to quickly acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands today of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people who may be in the room today. So before I want to kick off the discussion, I just wanted to give a little shout out to you, Lena. I was told before this all started that so much of this edition, and actually all of this edition actually, has been championed by your hard work. Interviews, essays, contacting people, bringing it all together. So I just wanted to invite us all to give a little round of applause to recognise all you've done. Thank you. And it's just so important we have these conversations around feminism and intersectionality. So please do have a read of the publication. It is a really interesting one. So first, I'm going to throw one opening question to all of you to kind of set the scene, which is, what does breaking the bias, the theme today, mean to you? So Div, we'll start with your reflections. What does it mean to you?
Ooh, I'm going to give you something controversial to kick off with. I actually think breaking the bias is almost, in an Australian context, a bit ambitious, because we've seen a lot of work on bias, and it's really been concentrated on education and awareness, more unconscious bias. But what we know of is that there's a lot of conscious bias, a lot of stereotyping of people based on their diversity attributes, and we all do it. We always we do judge people, and some of it is pretty conscious. So I'd say I wouldn't talk about breaking the bias necessarily. I would talk about understanding your own, but not staying too long in the education understanding phase, but moving quickly to looking at the reduction of bias with others. And we can all do it very regularly because we all are very aware of the things that we do on an ongoing basis. So I think reduction of bias is the first step, and then it'd be wonderful if it was breaking the bias as the next step.
Exactly. Even acknowledging that it exists in the beginning, even in the first stage. Robyn, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question, but from my own personal perspective, and I think I'm probably older than many people on the podium here today and in the audience, and having come from growing up in the 1970s and 80s in Adelaide, South Australia, I think breaking the bias has to start from within. And throughout my own career, I have definitely felt that what was shaping my own perceptions about what I could do and what others could do around me was very much based on my internal sense of myself. And so I think getting right down into the core of, what biases do we hold that may hold us back in terms of our potential is really important. Once you acknowledge that, then you can look up and see what other biases exist, and you can start to call those out and address them. So I would start right deep in the core.
Yeah, I like that. And Sunita, what about you?
Well, I'm going to echo what Div and Robyn have said. I think it is something that we have to address, those subconscious patterns of behaviour and ways of thinking that are ingrained in us, and it's there whether you like it or not. I'm growing up in Australia, and so it's about doing that, and only once you are working on that aspect, you can then try and encourage other women who maybe don't have the same opportunities and insights that you have to also, be able to, look within themselves. And then it's a sort of chain reaction. And looking specifically at the Asia-Pacific region, this is a place where community-minded thinking and working together is really rooted in the culture. So I think women helping women is a natural progression, and we're definitely starting to see that as well in the work of a lot of contemporary female artists at the moment.
Yeah, I love that too. Yeah, great.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I think a lot of the break the bias conversation has been individualized. So we're talking about individuals understanding their own bias, leaders understanding theirs, one-to-one, kind of interpersonal. But I would like to just challenge the audience to think about breaking the bias in the system, because that actually changes it scalably. And that's where you actually create opportunity and access for a lot of people, that you don't have to do this one-to-one kind of breaking the bias between each other interpersonally.
Something more deeper and systemic. Yeah, thanks, Div. Well, maybe we'll actually stay on that, and you do lots of work with all different businesses, I'm sure at very different stages of understanding concepts like intersectionality. But we know that there are many different ways to frame this, and one of them is the economic reasons. So in the current edition, the Disruptive Asia Volume 5, there is a piece by talking about how McKinsey has found that advancing women's equality in countries across the Asia Pacific could add up to US 4.5 trillion to their collective annual GDP by 2025. So what are some of your thoughts around how having a more truly diverse workforce could advance economic success and economic and social success in Australia?
I often love Mackenzie's assessment, and there's another, very popular Mackenzie number in terms of diversity represented and financial in performance. So one of the earlier Mackenzie studies talks about a 15% financial improvement for gender representation. And then when we look at ethnic people represented in leadership, it spikes to like 35% financial performance. But what challenges me with the conversations that I'm having in the workplace is, how do you get there? And a lot of how people think about inclusion needs to be changed, because we are still quite immature in Australia from a representational diversity effort. That's where our effort is concentrated. We're counting number of women in the workplace. We're counting people with different sexual orientations, different ability levels, ages, and we're doing the count, and we're looking at the numbers game of who's not represented where, and we're trying to fill the gap. Hence, a lot of our work has been around that count, and what we're not looking at is inclusion, which is where the financial improvement or economic improvement comes from. So the respect and the valuing of people who bring a different opinion, different worldview, is where you see the numbers changing. And I think we are pretty immature in Australian workplaces from what I can see, and we audit on this, is to how to value that. And especially in a work context, I always talk to our clients saying that work is a social determinant. And the fact that, Lena mentioned 13, I think it's 13.8%, or can we stand corrected, our gender pay gap, or 14.1. If you disaggregate women not born here, we do a lot of that gender disaggregation, and we see that number jump to 33 to 36%. And that's pretty significant, which means women who are not born here will have to work longer, will probably retire with 47 to 55% less super. So that's what we're creating. And work is a social determinant. So if you're not going to pay people fairly, and you're not going to allow them access into leadership positions, which allows that income level to jump, it means that they can only live a certain way, they only have a certain amount of discretionary spend, they probably can't afford a mortgage. So here's our social determinants. And what we're seeing in the job space, I think there's a new statistic that's come out just today. I think there are 900,000 Australians who are working 2 or more jobs. And they're primarily in the healthcare sector, education sector, allied health, and these are sectors dominated by women in Australia, and a lot of migrant women as well. So if you think about those big numbers, this is why we're not seeing the economic impact of intersectional gender inclusion and equity, is because we are really not leveling that playing field. We're not opening up systems to access, to fair access. And so we just end up creating change for some women, not all women. So that's my, big conundrum with, it's lovely, the Mackenzie figures. It's great to see that, this utopia of what could be if we actually included women fairly in the processes and the systems, but we're just not there, and we need to work harder at that.
Yeah, it's really surprising, even the lack of data around intersectionality, as you say. We can talk about gender, but what about migrant women? What about all these other intersections that we actually don't even have a picture of in Australia? Now, Robyn, I'm now going to throw to you about your essay in this edition. And you wrote about how the appointment of women to senior diplomatic and security in the Indo-Pacific is on the rise, and that the dynamic and culture of international engagement are shifting. So what do you mean by this? How so? And what is the benefit of having more women in senior political and diplomatic positions?
Yeah, it's a good time to be talking about this because we've seen a significant rise at the most senior political levels in representation across the region, but also in our own diplomatic representation from Australia. So just to give a flavour of this, across foreign defence and security roles in the region, we now have foreign ministers of Australia, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, New Zealand and Samoa, who are all women. And of course, our current Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, follows two former female Foreign Ministers, Julie Bishop and Marise Payne. And Marise Payne was also Minister for Defence, and she was followed by a second Minister of Defence, Linda Reynolds. So from Australia's point of view, we're very much part of this growing trend across the region. For our senior diplomatic representation, so our ambassadors and heads of post around the region, we currently have 44% women actually worldwide representing us diplomatically. And this is up from only about 25% 6 years ago, so there's been a dramatic increase. So across the region, we've got female heads of mission in Indonesia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Thailand and the Philippines, and deputies in a range of other big posts, including Singapore. And as I was mentioned, I've just got back from being the Australian ambassador to Vietnam, so I've left and my successor is a male, but other women have stepped up in Thailand and the Philippines at the same time. So encouragingly, we're starting to see a stabilisation of that representation, which is a very positive thing. So you ask about the benefits of all of this. So really, this representation in foreign affairs, security and defence environments is really changing the complexion of the conversation across the region and the complexion of diplomacy. It's a game changer. It has led to a fundamental shift in the dynamics and the culture of international and regional engagement and decision making. So when you've got women at the table in those big strategic discussions, which were formerly the purview of men, you get different perspectives and nuances, regardless of the sector, but we're looking at security, diplomacy. So the presence of women in those conversations allows us to identify the full range of issues and pressures that affect the security and the social and the economic landscapes in our partner countries and indeed in our own. This makes for more effective diplomacy and policies. It opens doors and it creates new networks. It allows us to get under the surface in a way that perhaps we didn't used to. So instead of discussions taking place on the golf course or over a beer, you have discussions, with community organisations, and you attend a different flavour of events, which does give you a different perspective. The other thing about having women in those roles is that gender perspectives become a natural part of the conversation. They don't have to be scripted, and it's a natural flow on when you're addressing any issue that gender perspective is brought in by women at the table. So in my essay, I mentioned a few different areas where you can really see this play out. And one of the big ones is peacekeeping and peace building. So 20 years ago, so the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 put the spotlight on women, peace and security. And at the international level, it really said, we have to acknowledge the disproportionate impact of armed conflict on women and girls. And women and girls need to be at the table when looking at negotiations, solutions, long-term peace building in post-conflict situations. And so the specific risks and impacts of conflicts such as sexual violence, the corrosive impact on women's economic livelihoods, all of that has been written into the script since then. And 20 years down the track, it's now an accepted part of peacekeeping and peace-building operations. Indeed, the resolution actually called on member states to put this at the heart of their operations. So that's one example. Another one that is really quite close to my heart, having just left Vietnam and having been there through COVID, is the impact of having women and strong gender perspectives on our development policies and programs. So Australia's response to COVID in Vietnam, we were able to pivot very quickly to take our development programs and really put them towards COVID recovery. But one of which I was particularly proud was that very early on we pivoted one of our programs, worked with UNFPA, UNICEF and UNDP to look at domestic violence and the impact of isolation and lockdowns on women's situation in the home and also in the workplace. So we came up with a program which we could stand up very quickly because of our deep engagement on gender issues, working with trusted partner agencies and the Vietnamese government. And we had easy communication channels, we had shelters. We really got below the surface of what women were experiencing and what they needed to be able to get the help and support that they needed. And then finally, when you've got women in these conversations, we're much more likely to understand and respond to the intersectional impacts of things such as climate, food security, economic security on women and girls. And again, that gets woven through our responses. So it's had a really significant effect, I think. And over the past 20 years or so, you can see a much stronger gender lens coming into the political, security, foreign affairs environment, particularly in the region. There's still a long way to go, but I can certainly see from my own perspective the way things have changed, and the conversations that I was having in my most recent posting, which is my 5th after a long career, are very different to the conversations we were having when I first started out in 1993.
And I love how you're talking about intersections of issues as well. That's a really interesting one because, of course, it doesn't exist in silos, that women are affected by compounding things that I guess create overlapping, barriers. So, Sunita, let's go to actually kind of change gears a little bit and talk about art. So throughout the publication, there's a tension between tradition versus change. How is this tension expressed in art? And are there overarching themes emerging from female artists?
So I actually think that there is a tendency to see tradition as the antithesis of change or a barrier to progress. But I'm increasingly seeing women artists in Asia harnessing these traditional practices, these domestic art practices, to tell new stories and articulate themselves about contemporary themes and issues. And these issues include the oppressive legacy of colonialism and patriarchal power dynamics. An artist I'd like to talk about in relation to this is the artist Yi Ilan. She's a Malaysian artist, and she has recently collaborated with a group of female Indigenous weavers in the state of Sabah in northern Borneo. And they together have created the work Tikar Meja, which translates to mat/table. Now, this work consists of 60 mats, on which each mat has been woven an image of a table. And in this context, the table symbolises, oppressive power and control, whether it be colonial, patriarchal, federal or state. And then the mat works as the opposite of this. It's woman-made, it's non-hierarchical, it's community-based, it's an open platform for gathering. So by weaving the table into the mat, we see this powerful 3D structure being reduced to this flat 2D image that is held within the confines of the textile. So I think it's super powerful, and I think it really is the symbolic reclaiming of power for these women.
Oh, I love that. That's really powerful. So, Div, I want to talk more about your work around intersectionality. So earlier this year, you worked with the Commission for Gender Equality in the public sector on applying intersectionality. What are the biggest challenges when it comes to, first of all, understanding intersectionality, but what does it genuinely mean for organisations to truly support intersectional communities in all of their diversity?
It's a big question. We'll try and break it down a little bit. I think your first part of your question is what's the biggest challenge, right? The biggest challenge for me in workplaces, whether it's private, public or not-for-profit sectors, is starting the conversation in terms of understanding, because immediately when people think about gender intersections, again, because the narrative is around counting women, it's this sort of easy count. So how many women with a disability do we have? How many women of different ages do we have? And it becomes about the count, less about the systems, especially in a workplace. And a lot of what we worked with the Commission for Gender Equality in the public sector was to look at the experiences of women from different backgrounds, different family structures, different social classes, and of course all of the range of diversity attributes across their experiences from recruitment, selection, onboarding, developing, advancing, and succession planning and thriving in a career. So when we looked at those experiences, women, we do a lot of listening sessions, and I'm a qualitative researcher, and that is where the real stories come out to understand how to actually break those biases in the system. And that's where the work of intersectionality comes in, especially from a leadership perspective or an organization's perspective. It's not about how many women from different backgrounds do you have in your workforce or your composition. It is about that, because if people are in decision-making roles, we need a good reflection of the communities that we serve. And for far too long, Australian gender equality making has been very homogenous, and we can see that very much in our numbers that we have reflected. And we, by the way, for the audience, the World Economic Forum ranks us as number 50 in our gender equality making. It's not good enough. We are a small, high OECD country who can be agile in our gender equality making, but we've really charted the work on women on boards, women in leadership, and when you look at the numbers, those women are not represented in terms of our Australian population and the women who are there. So, we have 51% of women in Australia, 30.8% are not born here, and 3.2% are Indigenous women. So I'll challenge you to tell me which organisation you engage with, whether it's from the healthcare system, education system, anywhere where you can see that representation back, firstly, and whether you can see that there's been work done on opening up those systems. So my biggest challenge is just to change the dialogue on where the work and the effort needs to be, and not tokenizing the count of women, because that is a very unsafe place to be. This knee-jerk reaction to go, oh gosh, we just need women of colour on the board, let's get 2 in, let's get a woman with a disability, a visible one, so we can showcase that in our visuals on our website. And that can be very damaging and very emotionally burdensome for those very few women who sit and carry everything, the narrative, the change making, the addressing of the barriers in the system, and that shouldn't be their work, right? So my biggest challenge is to just ask people to stop first before knee-jerk reacting into just filling the gap of who's left behind. So I think if you're working at gender intersections, you should realize that it's a compounding disadvantage every diversity label that you add. So whether it's sexual orientation, age, social class, educational background, parental status, every intersection that you add creates a compounding layer of lack of opportunity or access into systems, because Australia is quite a laggard in terms of working at gender intersections. So I think this is why we are number 50, and we haven't moved at all. We've actually fallen behind. From COVID, in 2019, we were number 46, and now we're number 50. So not a great report card.
Yeah, so many interesting points within that. And I'm wondering how many of you are resonating with taking on that burden in the workplace. Even though you're in there, it's so difficult to be challenging constantly, and that emotional toll, as you say, that also affects your professional reputation, it affects your own time. It's that qualitative experience that is often missed in that piece. So, Robyn, I want to ask more about women in leadership from an international relations perspective. So, as of September 2021, only 13 of the 193 countries had a female head of government. So it will take 130 years for parity in male and female national leadership to be achieved, according to the UN. What do you think is the reason or reasons for this? And in your personal experience, were there instances where being a woman was an additional challenge for you?
Thanks, Yasmin. So I won't go back over the long history of the reason that women are underrepresented at senior government levels. I don't think it's my place to do so, and I'm sure everyone's got their own understanding of how this has come about. But what I would like to talk about more is how we can continue to build change for the future and contribute to a world where all men and women have a chance to thrive equally and rise to senior leadership positions. But first of all, in relation to my own experience, I'm not sure if it was naivety or good fortune, but although, as I mentioned, I did come through university in the 1980s in Adelaide and then joined Foreign Affairs and Trade in 1990, and the world was full of barriers to women. I knew very few women in senior positions. I couldn't have named a senior female executive, for example. I knew teachers and headmistresses and doctors, but beyond that, my experience was pretty limited. But I wasn't really consciously aware of anything holding me back in my education. And when I joined DFAT with my graduate year in 1990, we actually had close to 50-50 gender balance, so 15 women to 17 men. And in the early years of training, we were all aspiring to the same things, postings overseas and an exciting diplomatic life. I got my first posting of choice. I went off to Hanoi, and that was quite a gritty choice at the time. So I never consciously perceived that I was being held back by gender. But when I got out into the big wide world and was operating in the broader diplomatic environment, I became conscious of the gender imbalance in that world. There were only 3 female ambassadors, in fact 2 female ambassadors in Hanoi when I got there, and that rose to 3 when Australia appointed its first female ambassador to Vietnam in 1994, Susan Boyd. And in my own diplomatic life, most of my counterparts were male, and they would ask me out because I was a female diplomat with a title, and so I counted. I'd go out to drink beer and rice wine and all the rest of it, but there were very few other women at the table. And then when I got back to Australia and was looking at my longer-term aspirations to rise up through the ranks, again, I can't identify specific instances where I was held back by gender, but as I mentioned earlier, the internal bias that I held and the internal editing, was I good enough? Could I compete? That was, helpfully, it drove me on, it spurred me to try even harder, but it was definitely there. And when I did get to the next level and did the next thing, I was always looking left and right, particularly, well, not particularly at my male colleagues, but at anybody. Could I keep up? And so I would look on that as something which affected a lot of us, and not just in foreign affairs and trade, but across many professions. So in summary, I think the main challenge that I can identify coming from gender is my own self-doubt and the need to constantly overcome that. And I don't think I was alone. Many of us sort of strove and started to rise through the ranks. But by 2015, it was clear that although we had strong gender parity in the department, there were a lot of people who were just stopping and weren't going on to the senior executive level. And so a decision was taken by the senior leadership, we had to fix this. What were we going to do? And that's when they came up with the Women in Leadership strategy. And what that strategy did was, from the top down and the bottom up, start to look at the tangible and intangible barriers to women's progression and to try and identify what was holding us back. And what was found was that, yes, bias was certainly there. The unspoken assumptions that women may not be suitable for roles, that once women had families, perhaps, going off to Afghanistan or Iraq was not going to be on the agenda. And so women were sort of self-editing themselves out of the process, and that had to be tackled. And so there was then a whole range of practical initiatives that were introduced. The most important, I think, was the if not, why not principle. And what that was, and again, from the top, introduced, so to really get it into the culture, to say, if you cannot identify a reason why this person cannot go off and do this particular role, why not? Why aren't they going? And that was a significant cultural shift, because it really turned the conversation around. Instead of thinking, can I do this? It was, well, why can't I do this? And that translated from everything to challenging overseas roles to family-friendly approaches to work and being able to juggle work and family. And that was a real game changer. And as the other thing I do think was that we had strong top-down leadership, so that the conversation was not seen as niche, it was seen as for the whole department. And that really changed things. So the result of the Women in Leadership strategy has been quite dramatic. In 6 years, we've seen, or it's 7 years now, a dramatic increase in the proportion of women overseas, as I mentioned. But now we also have 46% women at senior executive levels in the department, up from very low numbers, less than a decade ago. So in summary, I think there are things that hold us back. It comes from without and from within. You need a combination of cultural change, but also a systemic approach, which is really going to bring about change for the long term.
Yeah, I think that magic is in that combination, because it was almost to your point about how it's not just numbers. You mentioned top-down leadership, cultural, systemic change around workplace balance, and then also how we lead ourselves and how we view our own capacity as leaders as well. So Sunita, I want to talk about kind of wider cultural movements for a moment. So art is often seen as the mirror of cultural movements. Think about Black Lives Matter and all the incredible art, for example, that came out of that. How has the representation of women through art changed since the last century? And do you have examples of art changing society?
Since the last century, I would say that Asian women art has changed in two major ways. So firstly, I would say the art practices of women, and then secondly, depictions of women in art. So in terms of art practices, it was largely unrecognised pursuit. Art making, historically, for many women, it's gone uncredited, and you just have to look at the collections of many major museums and galleries around the world, and you have, Bowl by unknown artists, or it says Japanese or Chinese or Indian. There's no name, but we know that they were likely made by female makers. This type of art making generally for women consisted of, as I was speaking about before, traditional art making techniques and domestic-based art making items for everyday life. And then in terms of depictions of women in art, it has historically been picturing these women undertaking domestic work, as well as portraying women as these objects of desire or vessels of fertility. So I think probably, only since the last few decades is when I've begun seeing some real major changes in how women have, and I was saying before, harnessing those traditional techniques to really, make their names known. They're putting themselves as well, instead of letting somebody else, male artists, picture them in work and dictate how they are to be portrayed. They are now placing themselves centre, as well as picturing other women in their community, and using that to portray their feelings of anger, of sadness, of fear about the world that they're living in. But conversely, they're also showing messages of hope and images of female empowerment. An excellent example of this is the practice of Sujini embroidery in the Bihar state in northeastern India. And in particular, I want to talk about the artist Archana Kumari. She recently featured in the NGV's Transforming World exhibition, and she was taught this style of embroidery at a very young age, as were many of the other girls in her village. And it is a form of embroidery that is passed down through the generations, through the women, and it's exclusively practiced by women. So basically, while historically the practice has been to use second-hand clothing, dhoti saris, and embroider on them symbolic images of fertility, birth, marriage, in the form of plants and animals, Archana's actually reclaiming that, and she's using the embroidery to show images of daily life in the village that she lives in, as well as darker themes of female feticide and dowry revenge. These are still issues that are relevant in India today, and she's using this method as a form of activism to speak out against these issues. On the flip side, she's also portraying we have a work in our collection aptly named Women Empowerment, where she's showing women having access to education as well as transport, which gives them independence to travel between villages. Now, Archana, early in her career, was actually noticed by Asia Society, and they were able to support her going to New York to further her education and learn more about the textile trade. And she then has come back to India and has been able to completely make a life for herself, support herself completely, using this formerly very domestic art form. And she's now encouraging other women from her village to do the same. So in that sense, it's art completely changing a society and a whole generation of women.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we have a little over 5 minutes left, and I was going to pick your brains, Div, a little bit more about leveraging diversity, but maybe we'll save that for the final answer. So I'll throw to you, Robyn. What was mentioned in the beginning was that this edition often talked about the power of mentorship in supporting and empowering women. So once you break biases, like that's easy, but how can you become a good mentor and make sure that other women get the same or better opportunities? And how do you continue that momentum?
So I think, first of all, you have to recognise that you do have the power to be a mentor. And that was sort of a revelation I had, I don't know, sometime in the midst of time when I suddenly thought, what I'm saying to my fellow travellers is actually important. And as I moved up the ranks myself, I had something to share. So I recognised that I had that something to offer to those around me. I think the most important thing is to be the change that you want to see. And so throughout my career and throughout my personal and professional lives, I've always had a very strong focus on gender. And I have woven, as you know, I've grown and progressed through my career, woven that into many, many conversations that I've had and to a lot of the work that I've done. But I think importantly, you need to be accessible, you need to make it clear to those around you that you're prepared to have those conversations. You need to be authentic and genuine about your own experience and recognise and call out the things that have, you know, held you back or that you see, and be prepared to have those conversations with others. I also set great store in actively promoting development opportunities for those around me. So I consciously will look across teams that I lead and make sure that the women in the team and the men are getting access to the development opportunities that they deserve. So, for example, in the diplomatic world, I will always take a junior officer with me on any formal engagement to any meeting so that they get the opportunity to see what it's like and to, you know, see someone in action and then to believe that they can also take that role. In hosting diplomatic dinners, for example, always have women at the table, and when you do, you pick them out and make sure that they have an equal part in the conversation. Another thing that I've done quite consciously as the years have gone on is when women are being excluded, you know, use the position of authority that I might have to say, actually, such and such had a point to make here, and really draw them into the conversation. So there's all of that. It's both informal and formal. In my professional role as well, I will consciously seek out processes that are going to be affecting the culture and the operations of my own department. So, for example, formal processes on capability building and cultural and corporate change. Make sure that I have a seat at those tables, that I'm one of the ones who's shaping the culture that we're creating in the workplace. And that then reinforces the authenticity of a role that I can have as a mentor. But it's a lot about just, you know, being accessible, being authentic and willing to talk to people and support them.
Thank you. So final question, and if you could keep this to maybe 1 or 2 minutes just because of time. We've talked a lot about bias, and I'd even go a step further that we're talking about systemic discrimination, things that are rooted in our institutions and structures. It's one thing to create laws or install quotas, but how do you fight deeply rooted bias and discrimination that's often unconscious and something that even ourselves are affected by? And where should this change come from? And I'll also add, is there any part that you wanted to add as kind of a final note that we often don't talk about in these feminist conversations? Other pieces that you might want to leave the audience on a final note? So, Div, you could kick us off.
So much to say. Try and keep it brief. A couple of points. We need to stop talking about gender equality like it's women's business. Women need to fix themselves, or they need to lead the charge. Of course, they need to be consulted with. All the solutions need to be humanistically designed with them having a voice, absolutely. But the burden of the work need not be on women. An interesting statistic by Chief Executive Women is that 3 out of 4 men in Australia support gender equality. More than 80% plus of those men do not do any significant action that can be seen as gender equality making. So it's an intellectual agreement, And I think this shows our maturity or immaturity of the conversation around gender equality. So, there's a lot of talk about bias. There's been an overinvestment of training and education on bias. It's an $8 billion US training initiative globally, annually. We spend $8 billion on it, and probably most of the audience has been on some unconscious bias training. What we don't measure is the reduction of bias in moments that matter, in hiring, in promotion, advancement, etc., talent pipelining, succession planning. So my answer of your question is that we just are not doing enough in the right areas of change making. We're doing performative things that are not translating into impact and outcomes that we can see. And by what we're doing, it's not making a change in the lived experience of women anywhere, in any spaces that they belong to. So that's our big challenge, is that we're never going to progress from that number 50 mark, because we're number 1 on educational attainment in the world. We educate girls and women, absolutely number 1. Why are we still at number 50 for economic participation?
Yeah, I like that. I think the phrase there was moments that matter, moments that create discomfort, moments of when power is in question. That's when you can really see whether that transformation has happened. Robyn, what are your thoughts?
So as I said earlier, I think there does have to be a recognition that we all carry bias with us. Recognise it, call it out in yourself, and then call it out in others. But I think that all of that needs to be backed up by real practical action. And as I mentioned, the Women in Leadership strategy was one example, but there are lots of others. And one of the ones that really springs to mind is the power of something as simple as the panel pledge, which I'm sure everyone knows about, having 40-40-20 on any panel that you participate in. But more than that, in Vietnam, there was a real push by senior women business leaders to bring on Vietnamese male business leaders to take the panel pledge, which was quite a hard conversation to have. But once that happened, the impact was quite transformative, because in a culture like Vietnam, it really showed a shift in the mentality of males at the top of the business sector. So that's one thing. The other thing is the demonstrative effect of how we act. So during my diplomatic career, I've observed that when we take more women, for example, on delegations to regional and international meetings, what tends to happen is that other countries will start to match that, because they realise that there's an imbalance, and so more women start appearing at those tables. So there are 2 flow-on effects from that. A, that you break down the assumption that it's only the senior males who can take part in these events. Secondly, it empowers women to have a voice and a place at those tables, and it sort of locks that in for the long term. And it really flows on through our partner countries. So it's, I think, sort of backing up that kind of intellectual challenging of bias with practical demonstrations that actually this is real and this is the way we should be behaving for the future.
Yeah, thank you. And Sunita, final word from you.
So while I do feel that enforcing laws and installing quotas can have a great impact, maybe not always immediate, but in the years to come and definitely generations to come, I will say, and this is going to sound quite idealistic of me, and I'm not going to stop singing the praises of art, I do really feel that it has the capacity to provoke ways of thinking that can instigate change. So, for artists, art making is a form of communication that can work better than many other modes of communication. It's a form of communication that bypasses verbal language a lot of the time. And I think that's particularly relevant in the Asia-Pacific region, where there's over 2,000 different languages. We need to find more ways to communicate with one another and to a broad audience. And I think art can achieve that. I was speaking recently with a New Delhi-based curator, Minhaz Majumdar, and she said something that really resonated with me, and that's that in a patriarchal society where many Asian women exist, standing up and saying out loud what you really think is often difficult. And that's where art can be a tool to really safely express what we're really thinking and the inequalities that we may be facing.
Thank you. Well, there was so much to touch upon there. I think one of the things and my takeaways is what you were saying before about going beyond the numbers to listening to the people in this space and to ask whether they feel safe and supported and heard. And when businesses and organisations do that, that's when they can roll up their sleeves and actually do the work beyond the nice talk or beyond the one-time workshop. This is something that is rooted deeper. And as you say, art can be a mirror as well and a tool, a touch point for women, including women of colour, to have that agency in space in ways that the institutions so often can hide and marginalise and exclude them from. So thank you so much for that conversation. Just a quick round of applause to our amazing panellists tonight.